Hello, and welcome to What on Earth, the podcast in the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. In the fight to mitigate the impacts of climate change and hold global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees C in line with the Paris Agreement, methane is widely regarded as the second most important greenhouse gas we need to address. Tonne per tonne, it's 82.5 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period, and it's responsible for a third of the warming that's occurred so far. Methane emissions also contribute to the formation of ground-level ozone, a harmful air pollutant responsible for 1 million premature deaths every year. I'm Paul Newman, EIA's Senior Press and Communications Officer, and in this episode we're taking a look at the impacts of methane and what's being done to tackle the problem. Joining me is EIA climate campaigner Jack Corscadden, and we're very pleased to welcome special guest Christophe McGlade, an energy expert with the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. Christophe, Jack, welcome, and thanks very much for taking your time to share your thoughts with us today.
Thanks, Paul.
Cheers, Paul. Happy to be here.
Now, first off, why should people be concerned about methane?
I'm very happy to take that one. Thanks, Paul. You rightly pointed out there at the start that methane is the second most potent greenhouse gas, most important greenhouse gas. It's already caused about a third of the warming that we're experiencing today. And unfortunately, we are seeing that the concentration of methane in the atmosphere is continuing to rise. There's lots of attention that is placed on what we can do about carbon dioxide in particular. There's less attention that is being paid to methane. And that's part of the reason that, unfortunately, methane emissions keep on rising. And the science on this is very clear. If we cannot tackle methane emissions, if we don't find a way to bring down methane emissions from human activities, it won't be possible to reach our long-term target of limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, I can just kind of build on what Christophe is saying. As Christophe mentioned, methane is an incredibly powerful climate forcer, and it's responsible for a third of the warming we have experienced to date. And unlike CO2, which remains in our atmosphere for hundreds of years, methane's climate effect is extremely short-lived due to its atmospheric lifetime of 12 years. And so cutting methane emissions has been described by many as pulling the emergency brake on climate change. So this can really slow the pace of warming and help us to avoid dangerous climate tipping points while we take action in more hard to abate sectors. And that kind of covers things on the climate side, but there's also an air pollution angle here. So methane acts as a precursor to tropospheric ozone. This is also known as smog. And tropospheric ozone has a negative impacts on human health, crops, and the climate. So each year we see ozone is responsible for an estimated 1 million premature deaths, and it also leads to significant crop losses. So if we look at wheat alone, the losses annually within the European Union are approximately 24 million tonnes, which is greater than the annual production of Ukraine.
When you're talking about methane generally to a person in the street, for example, they might think of things like the flatulence of cows on farms as the main source of it. Christophe, what actually are the sources of methane that we're most concerned about, and what's the science behind it?
Yeah, so people in the street are right. Agriculture is a very large source of methane emissions. In fact, it's probably the largest single man-made source of methane emissions. We also get quite a large level of emissions coming from waste. So landfills, for example, people are throwing things away, organic waste away. It sits in a landfill, it degrades, and it releases methane to the atmosphere. I should also say there's lots of also natural sources of methane, from wetlands, from termites, from lots of natural sources. But most of the attention is really placed on man-made sources of methane. And the other really important source of methane emissions is the energy sector itself. So here we have fossil fuels, and we also have the burning of biomass, burning of wood and things like that. But it's really the fossil fuels sector that is the largest source of easy to abate methane. We often think about natural gas, for example. Natural gas is essentially just methane. It's exactly the same stuff. And along the production of natural gas, when it comes out of the ground, when it's getting transported, when it's getting put into pipelines or put into ships or into people's homes, some of that leaks. And that natural gas going into the atmosphere is methane emissions. And so that's a very large source of methane. The oil sector does the same thing. That whenever you produce some oil, you also produce some natural gas, and often that is leaked, or companies will be flaring that natural gas, and the burning of that gas doesn't always work. So again, you release methane to the atmosphere. And there's also coal mines. People will, I'm sure, have heard stories about why you have canaries in the coal mine. You have a canary in a coal mine because if there is a buildup of methane under the ground, the canary will be the first thing to let you know that there's a problem. And so coal seams themselves are very large sources of methane. And when you start mining the coal, whether that's a surface mine or under the ground, that will release methane, and that goes into the atmosphere. So around about a third of the methane emissions, which we can really do something about. There's a lot of potential there for cutting down on methane, and the reason that a lot of emphasis is placed on the fossil fuel sector is that that's where it seems that the easiest or the quickest wins could be on cutting down on methane. We know how to do it in the fossil fuel sector, and that's why. It's very important that we concentrate on what can be done in the fossil fuel sector to cut down on these methane emissions as quickly as possible. There are solutions, there's options for agriculture and for waste, but it's the fossil fuel ones where we know for sure that something can be done in the very immediate future.
And just to expand on that for a moment, is this something we can do and still be producing fossil fuels or extracting them at the rate we're doing? Or is this tied in with actually reducing our use and dependency on fossil fuels?
So there is many examples today already of companies and countries that produce oil and gas and don't emit methane emissions. And they've been doing it for decades. So this is nothing new technologically that's required. We know it's possible to produce oil and gas and not to result in methane emissions. So even if we are not able to bring about a peak in fossil fuel demand and fossil fuel supply in the next few years, there's a lot that we could be doing on methane in the interim. And in fact, the way that we describe this is that regardless of what happens to fossil fuel demand over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you should be taking action on methane. Explicit action on methane is perfectly possible. It's technically possible today. It's possible to keep producing profitably, and it's essential if we want to limit the near-term temperature rise as much as we possibly can do.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Jack, I know that you and your colleagues are working more closely on the policy side of things. Can you tell us a bit about what governments are actually doing to address methane emissions at present?
Yeah, sure. So we've seen there's real momentum around methane at the moment, as Christophe has just highlighted the sources, and we see real kind of will from governments to take action here. And this is kind of largely centered around the Global Methane Pledge. So the pledge was founded at COP26 in Glasgow in 2020, and it sets out a collective goal of reducing methane emissions by 30% in 2030 relative to a 2020 baseline. So this was created just 5 years ago, and today we have 159 countries have signed up to deliver this pledge. So this highlights the political will to act on methane. So we're at this halfway point of the timeline, and the Global Methane Status Report, which was launched last week at COP, shows that although methane emissions are still rising, the projected 2030 emissions under current legislation are already much lower than forecasts, than earlier forecasts. And this is due to a mix of national policies, sectoral regulations, mainly in the energy sector, and kind of just general market shifts. But of course, we will only, the report also warns that we'll only achieve kind of full-scale implementation of proven and available control measures will close the gap to this 2030 target. But more so, targets are great and they give us a direction of travel, but the pledge will live on beyond 2030. So it's about maintaining that community of practice and supporting countries, particularly in the global south, to address their emissions. We also saw the launch of a new program by the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. So this is known as the Super Pollutant Country Action Accelerator. And this is a new 3-year program to help governments in the global south to drive deep and sustained reductions in super pollutant emissions. And this, of course, includes methane. And there are plans to expand this program to other countries in the global south, and this will hopefully serve as a catalyst to accelerate action on methane emissions.
Oh, thanks for that. Are there any particular global hotspots for methane? I'm not sort of suggesting you point a finger at any particular country and say that that's at fault, but where are methane emissions, if you like, found in the largest profusion?
So it tends to vary depending on the country. The kind of sectoral emissions. So more developed economies have kind of better waste management practices and likely have more efficient fossil fuel operations if they do have production. So if we look at the energy emissions, the majority of these take place during production. So we can look at the countries that actually produce fossil fuels. And as Christophe said, this is just a matter of will. To mitigate these emissions. So from their perspective, methane that leaks from pipes during transportation or during production, this is a lost resource. So from an efficiency perspective, these companies should want to reduce these emissions. So we've seen countries like Norway have very low methane intensity, very low leaks. They banned venting and flaring as early as the 1970s. But then we see other countries, the likes of Russia, the likes of Algeria, that don't seem willing to invest in the technologies to abate their emissions, and as a result have very high leakage from their fossil fuel infrastructure.
And perhaps if I could just give a number there to kind of illustrate how big that gap is that Jack mentions. So we've looked at individual countries at the International Energy Agency, looking at what their methane emissions from oil and gas production are. And what we see is there's about a factor of 100 difference between the best performers, like Norway, as Jack mentioned, and between the worst performers. So that factor of 100 is, I mean, that's enormous. I mean, that's for every barrel of oil you produce, you leak 100 times more methane from one country to the other. And the other quite worrying aspect when it comes to methane is that we still see that countries themselves are underreporting their amount of leaks. So we're getting more and more information now about where there are hotspots of methane emissions. We have satellites, for example. We have flyover campaigns where planes fly over an area and detect how much methane is being leaked from it. We have people with drones. We have people with cameras. We have loads and loads of ways now of understanding, of measuring and monitoring methane emissions. And what we see is that there is a big gap between what countries and some companies report versus what actually appears to be the case based on the available and best science. So that underreporting itself is probably holding back action. Countries, if they're not aware of how badly they are performing or how bad the problem is, then they have less incentive to go out and actually do something about it. So closing that gap, that factor of 100 gap is incredibly important, but also improving the measuring, improving the monitoring, improving the understanding that there is of methane emissions is also going to be a catalyst towards further action.
The underreporting you mentioned, is this something that's being intentionally done by some countries, or is this just because they're not monitoring their own emissions, so they don't have the data at their hands to release it?
There's a bit of both in there. I mean, it's in many cases they are probably just not aware of the scale of the problem. In many cases, particularly those countries, for example, that might have a national oil company, and a lot of the activity and a lot of the oversight of the oil and gas industry is sort of given to the national oil company. The company itself might just not be aware that methane is a bigger problem than they think. That's because they haven't done the measurement, they haven't done the monitoring. As Jack mentioned, some countries have done this, in the 1970s, but others just they haven't had that incentive to go out and look for the methane emissions. In other cases, because people are aware that this is a problem, and because there is now an increasing effort by importing countries, particularly, for example, those countries and regions that are importing lots of natural gas, including Europe, including Japan, including Korea, and others, they're putting more and more emphasis now on understanding the methane emissions associated with their imports, and so they want to shine a spotlight on this. And in some cases, countries therefore might be, well, okay, we if we don't go and look for the problem, we won't necessarily have to say that emissions are so much higher than they would otherwise be. Again, there's action in this area that by shining a spotlight on it, from what satellites are doing, from what countries are doing to incentivize exporters to take more action, to look for the leaks, that is already helping to reduce emissions. So hopefully, as Jack says, we do start to see some of these emissions coming down. But it has been a problem for a very long time now, and it's only been getting worse over the past decade or so.
You mentioned earlier on that we don't have to reinvent the wheel to begin to tackle methane, that we've already got technology that's been in place for a while now. Can you tell us a bit about the technologies that are actually available to mitigate methane emissions?
There's a few different elements here. And again, I'm going to focus on the oil and gas sector, because that's really, even within the energy sector, it's the oil and gas sector where we see the biggest potential and the biggest opportunity there to reduce emissions as quickly as possible. So one is a very simple, it's called leak detection and repair. You ask someone to pick up a thermal camera and walk around an oil and gas production facility. And you need a thermal camera because you can't see methane, but with a thermal camera, you can do. And very often when they do this leak detection and repair program, they will see a leak, and actually it's very, very quick to fix. Someone's left a hatch open on a tank, a bolt has come loose, a bit of equipment has broken, and often it's very quick to fix that. The difficulty is in finding the leak as quickly as possible. So that's why regularly introducing leak detection and repair programs is a great way of cutting down on emissions. It doesn't always have to be a person with a camera. You can now use drones. They can fly over a facility, just hover above that facility, and if a spike in methane is detected, the operators there will know that something is wrong. Similarly, satellites can do that. You now get satellites that have a really, really fine resolution. They can really focus in on an individual facility and say, yep, we've seen a leak in this very specific point, and then that will alert somebody to go and do something about it. So that is one big area, just defining the leaks, because they're very quick to fix. Another big area is on equipment. It has historically been the case that in many parts of the world, the oil and gas industry installed equipment which was, by its design, it leaked methane. It didn't have minimizing methane emissions in mind whenever they installed it. These are things like pneumatic controllers in oil and gas facilities. And you can replace those controllers, which have a very high level of methane emissions, with one that does exactly the same thing, but it avoids the methane leaks from occurring. So just that simple replacing. It's not an expensive piece of kit. You have to go out and do it, of course, but it's just replacing your existing equipment with something that does exactly the same job, but without leaks. And the other big area, I mentioned this already, flaring. So there are many cases around the world. There are many facilities around the world which flare gas on a regular basis. Now they shouldn't do this. A huge number of countries have signed up to stop flaring. This is where you get a little bit of natural gas produced alongside oil. You can't sell it for whatever reason, and so you just burn it. Now, if that flare was working as it should do, it shouldn't be releasing any methane at all. It should just be combusting the natural gas into CO2 and emitting CO2. It's not great. It shouldn't be done, but it's better than doing that than just venting that methane straight up into the atmosphere directly without burning it. But what we see is that in many cases, those flares are not operating as they should do. So they should be always operating at close to 100% efficiency. And sometimes they're only going at 90% efficiency. And what that means is that 10% of the gas that you're putting into that flare is leaking. It's coming up as methane. And again, it has a much, much more potent impact on climate change than the CO2. So again, replacing flares, stopping flares in the first place would be a very good opportunity and a very good thing for countries doing. But at the very least, check your flares are working. Check that they are operating at 100% efficiency. We're not going to be able to eliminate flaring entirely. Sometimes there's an emergency and you have to flare, but making sure when you are flaring that there is no methane leaks occurring, that would also have a very substantial impact on cutting down on emissions in the near term.
Just for my own curiosity, what alternatives to flaring are there? What would you do with that if it's of no value to actually capture it? You can't sell it. What would they be expected to do with it?
One option is just to inject it back into the ground. So that is actually a very good way of extracting more oil from the ground. So this would generally be the case at facilities and fields that are oil fields. But it's always the case you get a little bit of natural gas with the oil. And if that amount of natural gas, if it's coming out from the ground, you can re-inject it, and that keeps the pressure under the ground more higher and can force some more oil up. The other option is that in many of the cases, actually, we see it's not that far a distance. We now have satellite readings as to where flares are occurring. We know where the gas pipelines are. That you have to do something to get that gas from the facility to the nearest pipeline or to the nearest demand center. You can put it on a truck. You can build a pipeline in some cases. Or you can use it on site. You could, for example, use it on site to power generation. You require power to keep all your operations going in an oil and gas facility, in a oil and gas field. And so using that flared gas rather than from another source, again, that would be a way of avoiding that flare from happening. But it is the case that investment is required for that. And that's one of the reasons that we haven't seen people taking the action on flaring that is absolutely needed.
Because at the moment it's just so much cheaper to burn it than to find any use for it.
Exactly.
Now, when we look at ways to address methane, obviously it's not just about the available technologies. Jack, what role does regulation have to play as we go forward from here?
Yeah, so regulation has a huge role to play in this. So the majority of methane emissions in the energy sector specifically can be mitigated cost effectively. So in the oil and gas sector, around 30% of industry's emissions today could be avoided with measures that offer a return of investment of above 25%. So this return on investment is well above the thresholds that normally dictate capital investment decisions within major oil and gas companies. And many of the abatement options can pay for themselves within a year. So this represents the carrot. But despite this high return on investment, these investments are just not being made. And that's where regulations come in. So the stick. They're needed to force fossil fuel companies to mitigate their emissions. As we just heard in the flaring example, this is just the easiest thing for them to do. You just burn it off or you vent it and it's job done. So without regulations, many of these companies are just not going to do this. There are some voluntary initiatives where more progressive and more kind of, I would say, climate conscious companies may choose to engage and try and reduce their flaring. But in general, it's just the easiest thing for these companies to do. And when we look at the annual revenue of major oil and gas companies, the revenues required to mitigate these emissions is really a drop in the ocean. So governments need to force them to take action here. And we have examples of that. So the EU methane regulation is a pioneering piece of legislation. So in addition to covering methane emissions linked to domestic oil and gas production, so this is requirements for leak detection and repair, bans on venting and flaring. It also seeks to address the supply chain emissions linked to EU fossil fuel imports. So this is the first regulation that seeks to mitigate methane emissions beyond its borders in another jurisdiction. And of course, with that, it will require compliance from third-party actors. And this regulation has come under significant pressure in recent years. So there's calls from the US administration to delay the implementation of the regulation. And of course, industry are really pushing back on this. But it has been adopted. The regulation was adopted in August of 2024. And the EU member states have established competent authorities to oversee its implementation. And EU export partners are beginning to work towards complying with the requirements for monitoring, reporting and verification, and the import standard, which will come into play in 2030. Yeah, so I can expand a bit more. So this is the EU approach, which is kind of the best in class, but we have also seen developments in other regions. So we have the Clean Initiative in Asia. In Latin America, we have seen moves to develop a low methane oil and gas market. And while these may be voluntary initiatives at present, if these approaches can be strengthened and brought under a strategic coordination, they will then capture a greater share of the global fossil fuel market. And this could send a unified signal to both producer countries and industry actors to reduce their methane emissions. And they can one day hopefully work towards becoming legislation to require these cuts.
One final question. A bit speculative, I know, but what developments or strategies would you both like to see in the future to help combat methane emissions to a more effective degree than we're doing at present?
I think, just picking up on what Jack said, the key thing here is regulation. We know the scale of the problem. We know how to tackle it. We know that you can do it cost effectively. The thing is, we're just not doing it. And because we have those first three elements, that's really where governments need to step in. And as Jack absolutely points out, there are lots of pledges now. We have the Global Methane Pledge. We have pledges from companies. that a lot of the companies have signed up to an initiative called the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which looks to reduce methane emissions down to near zero levels by 2030. So we have loads of pledges. What we just need to really do now is work on the implementation of those. Governments have a key role to play. There is also a role there for industry. And one of the things that would be really good to see is that we know there are very good operators when it comes to methane emissions, that they can produce with very low emissions intensities. If they can share their knowledge and practices and technologies with those more poorly performing companies, that would have a material impact. And one area in particular here, and it might seem a bit niche, but actually it's really important, is that when you look at the best performing companies today, many of them only apply their approaches to methane to their own operated assets. So the facilities that they actually have direct operational control of. But the nature of the oil and gas industry today is that lots of those international oil companies, they have little shares, little stakes in lots and lots and lots of other facilities, which they don't operate, but they are willing and happy to take the oil and gas from it because they paid the capital up front to help develop that field. If those companies could apply their methane practices and their methane technologies to those non-operated assets where they have that equity stake, that would have a huge impact on emissions, because many of those non-operated assets are in parts of the world where we know methane emissions are very high. And so just simply translating those existing targets that companies have onto their non-operated assets, that would also help turn this thing around. So governments absolutely need to play a big role. And companies also need to step up and do much more and push this forward.
And Jack?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to see two things. The first is in the context of the Global Methane Pledge, I'd like to see the creation of a dedicated methane fund to support global south countries in addressing their methane emissions. So to date, the financial support provided has been uneven, it's unpredictable, and it's very project-based, which really hinders governments from carrying out long-term planning to effectively address their emissions. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, more specifically in the energy sector, I'd like to see more countries adopt measures on fossil fuel imports. So it's really not enough for developed countries to sit back and just look at their domestic emissions and assume that the job is done. I think these countries have a responsibility to address their supply chain emissions, so they really need to go beyond their borders and look at methane emissions that take place upstream. And to do this, I'm not suggesting a direct replication of the EU methane regulation, but something that aligns with the spirit of this regulation. So requirements for increased reporting requirements, eventually working towards a better performance standard. And in doing so, we could capture a greater share of imported fossil fuels and send a signal to global markets.
Excellent stuff. Well, Christophe, Jack, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you both about this, and hopefully we can have you back at some future episode and you can tell us how much better things are going then.
Hopefully so.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Christophe.
Thanks very much, Paul. Cheerio.
Pleasure having you, man. If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please watch this space for future episodes, and do check out our website at eia-international.org to find out more about our work. Thanks for joining us, and wherever you are, stay safe out there.